Hi, I'm Matt Mayfield, and you're watching the Audio Fundamentals course. So we've seen how threshold and ratio affect a compressor, but the examples so far have been very limited because they only show a compressor that instantly catches all sound. A real compressor takes time to respond to the sounds. So this brings us to two other parameters, attack and release. Those are the same words as you saw in the ADSR envelope, and they're used somewhat similarly, but not exactly the same, as with so many things in audio. In the case of a compressor, attack is the time that it takes for the compressor to respond to the sound. Release is the time it takes for the compressor to let the level come back to normal after the sound drops below threshold. And, as you might have hoped, we have a graph. This is similar to before, where we've got amplitude over time, and we've got the threshold. Let's say we have a synthesized sound that plays loud and then gets soft. And let's say that the loud part is above the threshold and the soft part is below the threshold. Now we're going to be looking at amplitude over time here. So when we have this compressor working with attack and release times, this is what the sound will look like after compression. The white line represents what the compressor does. So here at the top left, at that point, the compressor sees that the signal is above the threshold. So it reacts, beginning to turn it down. And you can see the white line starts to curve down. By the time it's done turning down the amplitude level, the amount of attack time has passed. So the attack time is setting how long it takes the compressor to respond to signals above the threshold. Now as we follow the white line along, we see it dips down fairly quickly to a point below the threshold. At number 3 here, the compressor notices that the signal is below the threshold and begins to let it come back up. The release time is what determines how long that takes. Here are some examples of what different attack and release times do to sounds. With a long attack time, the sound becomes more pointed and punchy like staccato because the initial transient, the first moment, is let through at full volume, and then the body of the sound is turned down. With an extremely short attack time, the sound becomes more smooth and in your face. For release times, a longer release time can have a more natural effect, but you can hear a sort of a pumping and breathing sound. With a short release time, there's less pumping, but it brings up lower sounds like room noise, reverb, things like that. I'm running a little bit of compression on my voice here, and you're probably hearing all the raindrops hitting my air conditioner. And the thunder. Fun stuff. Let's look at what those attack and release times do to some sounds. Here I've got a synthesized drum kit. I can play some of these notes here. And you can see all of that on the waveform, how most of these have a sharp attack and then the body dies away. This is perfect to demonstrate the attack and release times. Let's start by turning on the compressor, finding a place where the gain reduction meter, there's like a backwards meter that tells you how much the compressor is turning down the sound when a signal exceeds the threshold. We're doing about 5 decibels of compression. Right now, the attack time is set to 23 milliseconds, which is enough time to let a bit of that attack pass through and give the drum more of a staccato sound, because some of the body is being taken away. If we then increase the makeup gain by a couple decibels, we get a much punchier drum than with the compressor bypass, even though the body is at about the same level now. See how that initial transient with the compressor on is higher than with the compressor off. Obviously, this is where we're using makeup gain. That's gain that happens after all the compression to bring the signal back up after it's been reduced by the compressor. So you've seen the effect of attack time at a relatively, at least for this drum, a relatively long time. If we set the attack to 0, do you see how the initial transient, the first moment of the sound, is now being caught by the compressor? This is without compression. Here's with. Without, with. And all that has to do with tuning this attack time. If we set this back up again to 20-some milliseconds, now the part of the compression that's being taken away is part of the body of the sound, not the initial punch. That's how a compressor can make a sound either smoother and less punchy, or it can make it more punchy by changing the amount of the body versus the initial attack that it affects. We can explore release time best if we have a mix of things that one compressor is operating on. It's worth mentioning that a compressor can't reach into the mix of sounds that it's operating on and extract different parts. When I say that compressors can sometimes bring up the room tone or the reverb, I'm not saying that they're actually separating that out from the mix. That they do that just because when the sound drops to a lower level, those are the parts that are left. And when it turns up the volume of the entire track that it's operating on, that's what gets increased. So let's say we have a drum track where we've got the crash cymbal happening on every beat. That's without any compression. Let's apply some fairly obvious compression. I'm going to reduce the threshold and increase the ratio to make sure that it's going to compress the sound a lot, so it's very obvious to hear. Since the snare is one of the only things that's exceeding the threshold and making the compressor kick in, its attacks are coming through the mix much more than anything else. Since the release time is so quick, the instant the snare drum stops its attack, the signal drops below the threshold again, and the compressor turns it back up. If we set the release time to longer, though, here's what happens. I'll set it to even longer so this is more obvious. There's some pumping. You can hear that the cymbal kind of fades back in if I hit the snare and cymbal at the same time. Let's make this even more obvious. Let's also set the attack very low. Set these accordingly. You might recognize this sound, where the cymbals kind of fade in after every drum hit, and that's because of the compressor. The whole pumping and breathing thing. You can fine-tune that using the release time. Other parameters you might find on a compressor vary from individual model to model. Usually there is a setting for input gain and output gain, often called makeup gain. There's sometimes a knee. Some compressors have automatic makeup gain and an automatic release time. Thanks a lot for watching. As usual, leave comments if you like, questions, subscribe to the channel, tell everyone you know about these videos if you like them, and if you don't like them, shh, don't tell anybody. I'm Matt Mayfield, thanks again, and I will see you next time.